Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. Here we talk to the key players at PETA and the movement and ask them about how animal rights change their lives and how they stay motivated to make the world a better place for the animals. On today's episode, sexual perversity in university labs, what they do to animals in the name of science.
These experiments are kind of an opportunity for people to act out on some twisted impulses. I don't think that the majority of animal experimenters are necessarily sadists or getting some sort of pleasure. I think that they've been kind of brought into a culture that doesn't even see the animals. Like I said, they're viewed as just another piece of laboratory equipment. And so I don't think that they think about hurting the animals any more than they would think about hurting the cage that the animal's housed in. It's all just equipment to them. But that being said, I do think that there is a certain percentage of people who are involved in the animal experimentation industry who probably are sadists. It's not that all animal experimenters or most animal experimenters are sadists or have dark impulses. But if you are a sadist and you do have a dark impulse, this seems like a career that might be attractive to you.
Jeremy Beckham, a researcher with PETA's Laboratory Investigations Department, talking about the researchers who take millions of taxpayer dollars to conduct the most obscene and perverse-sounding experiments on animals, primarily rats, mice, and hamsters. What does observing the sex life of rats, mice, and hamsters have to do with anything related to humans, besides masking a sense of prurience for science? We'll talk about the experiments and the one school still taking your money and abusing animals. That's next on the PETA Podcast. But first, thanks again for joining us here at the PETA Podcast. Please share a link with your friends and let them know the animals have a voice on the PETA Podcast. Go to our webpage at PETA.org and binge on some of my favorites. There's the first episode with PETA President and co-founder Ingrid Newkirk, who debunks all the myths you've heard about PETA and animal rights, especially the ones on no-kill shelters. Want to hear directly from Ingrid about no-kill shelters? It's there on episode 1. Also catch episode 14, where Ingrid talks about her strange encounter with Google. If you want to hear more about laboratory testing, you can listen to how PETA saves millions of lives by getting labs to modernize by using non-animal methods. Unfortunately, it's not as easy as you think to change the calcified thinking that would rather kill animals, because that's the way it's always been done. Listen to episodes 23, 20, and 11. And if your friends are still eating hot dogs at baseball games, some of the kosher dogs may actually be produced through a shackle and hoist method that will make you seek a vegan alternative. Listen to episode 19 for the truth on kosher beef. Remember, if you're on Apple Podcasts, don't forget to rate and review the show. It helps the algorithm know that PETA has a podcast on the issues important to you. Now, if you really want to help animals, you can always hit the Donate Now button at PETA.org. And if you're high-tech and have Amazon's Alexa, it's as easy as saying, Alexa, donate to PETA. And now to our episode. Jeremy Beckham, researcher with PETA's Laboratory Investigations Department, talks about the perverse experiments done around the country, from BU in Boston to UC in Berkeley, and points in between, like the Texas Women's University in Denton, Texas, and the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. They've all conducted millions of dollars of sexual experiments, torturing rats, mice, and hamsters, and then observing their sexual activities. And for what scientific reason? Good question. Here's my interview with PETA's Jeremy Beckham on the sexual perversity in university laboratories on this episode of the PETA Podcast. When most people think about experiments on animals, they probably assume they're only done when there are no other methods available, and then only to search for cures for deadly disease. And we know that's not necessarily the case, but most people don't usually think that animals are used for experiments about sex. PETA exposed these particular experiments several years ago. And what were the experimenters doing?
So all across the country, at some of the most well-known universities in our country, there are some pretty hideous experiments that are going on, these sick and twisted sex experiments that are happening on mice, rats, and hamsters. Let me give you just a couple quick examples. And one of the most shocking things about all these examples is that these are subsidized and paid for with taxpayer money. So you're paying for this, folks. At Johns Hopkins University, for example, there was a long-running experiment there where mice and rats had their penises electrically stimulated after they were mutilated, and they were injected with chemicals. And they would actually electrically stimulate their penises for up to 5 minutes, and then see if they could sustain an erection. After they went through this torture...
Jeremy, we have to let this sink in, I think.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
They have mice and rats. They're electrically stimulated after their penises are cut off. So they don't have a penis, right?
Well, they do have a penis, but it's been mutilated so that they can have electrodes placed on it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then,
so they cut all of the skin off the penises and then attach these electrodes directly onto the blood vessels, basically.
And then they're stimulated for up to 5 minutes because that's how long it takes an erect mouse to give a result.
I mean, I don't exactly know how they arrived at 5 minutes, to be honest with you, but that was for as long as it could be, was up to 5 minutes. And then at the end of that, all of these animals are then killed and their penises are completely cut apart so that experimenters can look at this. And one of the most shocking things about all this, too, is all of this nonsense just in this one laboratory at Johns Hopkins University cost more than $2.7 million.
Well, Jeremy, now, we know that people are curious, but what can you possibly get from a study like this? I mean, I guess rats and mice are our stand-ins, right? So we substitute a rat and a mouse for a human. We'd say, oh, we'd never do this to a human being. Or I don't know, maybe we would. I don't.
Right. I mean, it does kind of boggle the mind to try to wrap your head about what possible rationale could go into this. And I think that you can't understand this without understanding that there is a broad culture in the animal experimentation industry as a whole to allow this kind of thing to happen. I mean, this is not an aberration, really, in some sense. I mean, I have several more examples that I can list to you of similar kind of twisted sex experiments that are happening at Boston University, Texas Women's University in Denton, Texas, UC Berkeley.
Let's take it one at a time. We went from Johns Hopkins, a rather esteemed place of learning and higher education. Now, take us to Boston University, BU, up there in Boston. What do they do?
So at BU, experimenters locked female mice into these restraint devices, and then they drilled holes into their skulls and burned lesions directly into their brains. Sadly, this lesion burning of brains is something that's fairly common in neurological laboratories to animals. It happens to monkeys and rats and cats. There's examples of this all over where you burn different parts of the brain and then see how it affects the animal's behavior after that. So after these females had parts of their brains lesioned, they were then presented with urine samples from other males, and some urine samples were from castrated males, and other urine samples were from intact males. And they wanted to see these female mice who had their brains lesioned. They wanted to see if they spent longer sniffing the urine samples from the castrated mice compared to the not castrated mice.
And the conclusion that you would get from this is that these female mice with their brains drilled or with holes drilled in their heads and lesions in their brains would be able to determine whether or not they could get a better partner from one kind of male versus another? What?
That's basically it, actually. Yeah, that's exactly it. Now, the actual public health relevance for humans from all of that is kind of anyone's guess. I mean, the experimenters will always find ways to tie it into all kinds of grandiose claims about solving erectile dysfunction or sexual dysfunction or even depression. The reality is that those kinds of claims don't really ever pan out. But nevertheless, Boston University and all these other institutions that do these experiments, they get to rake in all this grant money, right? And the way that they measure success, and I think this is kind of a key point to understanding why this all continues, why this, because there's no common sense here at all, really. I mean, this whole world of what they call basic research, which is basically research for curiosity's sake, right? There's not a clear application for this kind of research. And the reason this kind of absurdity is allowed to continue is the way that these people measure productivity or success of an experiment is in terms of papers being published. And there's, in this whole industry, there's a giant crop of journals out there that will publish this kinds of nonsense because there's a large community of other people carrying out this nonsense. And so they'll read what their other people are doing elsewhere, but none of it actually gets translated into anything clinically meaningful, which is supposed to be the whole point of the National Institutes of Health. It's like they've kind of lost the point of what this was all supposed to be about.
So they've created this subculture that feeds on itself and creates a broader welfare subculture for the scientific community that's paid for by just average working Americans like you and me.
That's right. And it's paid for by average working Americans like you and me under the guise that this is what's going to cure cancer and find an effective vaccine for HIV and all these other really legitimate public health concerns that people have. They piggyback off those concerns to get more and more funding for this nonsense, and things are getting kind of lost in translation. So the NIH, pretty much every single year, has their budget increased by Congress because no member of Congress wants to appear like they're slashing funding for cancer research. But what people don't realize is that the money that NIH is being allocated by Congress is being diverted. About half of the NIH's budget is going into animal model-based experiments like this that have very little relevance for people. So there's just, I think, a general lack of awareness that the NIH is not using the funds that it's being awarded very judiciously at all.
So your tax dollars at work, we're not curing cancer. We are finding out about the sex drive of a female mouse with lesions drilled into her brain.
That's right. And what's so crazy is, so both of those examples that I mentioned to you, they each received, one of them received $1.5 million approximately in taxpayer funding, and the other one was over $2 million. Now, the good news in all of this is that those experiments are no longer ongoing. Those experiments have had their funding ended. But my question is, what do they have to show for this now? I mean, they published these papers. Did this actually lead to anything clinically significant, any sort of new treatment or therapy or anything at all? And that's the piece of this puzzle that never gets asked. They hand out money, they publish papers, the institution gets to keep a good chunk of that money, and that's kind of the end of the story. No one goes back and follows up and asks, now, what was the point of all of that? Right? And that's what's missing in this system.
Yeah, there's no accountability. And perhaps the greatest tragedy here is that there was no joy on the part of the mice. They were all killed and dissected.
Right. And that's a fairly common thing as well, that the animals will be killed and they'll have their bodies cut open for further examination.
Now, I know that there are two others that are on this list. One is at Texas Women's University in Denton, Texas, in North Texas, up there by Dallas, and another at the very, well, it has a reputation for being a liberal institution, UC Berkeley. So let's go one by one. What happened at the Texas Women's University in Denton, Texas?
So at Texas Women's University, experimenters injected female rats with antidepressant drugs and then placed them with male rats. And then the female's sexual receptivity, which was indicated by the downward arching of their backs. Experimenters observed that and measured it. So, and then after they did that, they manipulated the female rats by surgically removing their ovaries and injecting sex hormones, and then again observed these rats' sexual behavior. And for all of that, I just described to you, taxpayers had to pay a little over $2 million.
Well, now, the relevance to humans may be the drug that they use. I mean, this was an experiment, female rats with specifically Prozac. I mean, that might have some, that might be of some help to people who are taking Prozac out there, no?
Well, one thing to remember is that when you're talking about testing a drug in an animal, how a drug reacts or how an animal's behavior is affected by a drug is not going to tell you anything about how that drug is going to react or behave in a person. Okay, so penicillin, for example, here's one example to take. Penicillin, which ushered in this whole new era of antibiotics, is completely ineffective in rabbits because rabbits excrete the drug before it can be absorbed. It kills guinea pigs, and it's an effective treatment in humans. So you have 3 different species there, but you have one drug with 3 different reactions in each of those species. And there's tons of examples like that. I mean, the irony is that the FDA, in their outdated rules that require animal testing, they have something called the 2-animal rule, is what they call it, which is you're supposed to test a drug on 2 different species of animal. And usually, drug manufacturers will test it in monkeys and dogs and rats. That's very common, that you'll see all 3 of those. But sometimes they'll do 2 of those 3. And the rationale for testing these drugs in these different species is, well, we better do it in multiple species because different species react to this drug differently. That was the original rationale for that. And it's like, well, then how in the world are we supposed to take that data and use it to predict a response in a human? You've already acknowledged that these drugs are going to react differently in different species, and now we're throwing humans into the mix, which is another species. So it's really a fundamentally flawed paradigm.
And then also, they could pick the 3 animals that all 3 of the species don't respond. So then you have a bad test after bad test after bad test.
Yep, and you can keep testing your drug until you find the result you want, too. That's the other crazy thing about this system, is you can test the drug in different strains of rats or mice, because they've invented all kinds of different strains of rats and mice. And different strains don't even react the same way to the same drug. So you can keep on hunting and pecking until you find the data you're looking for. That's kind of the handy thing about animal experimentation. One of the main reasons it continues is that it's sort of a, we call this confirmation bias, where you form your conclusion and then you look for the evidence after the fact to confirm your conclusion. And animal models are wonderful for that. They're just a giant exercise in confirmation bias.
And as long as we have this species bias, then we just we devalue the animals and just go through them without thinking or caring, and without having any relevance.
When you're
to humans.
Describing an animal experiment in a published paper, they list the animals under the materials section of a published paper right alongside the laboratory equipment. They're just another material that's used in the experiment. That's how they're viewed in this system.
So we were talking about the Texas Women's University. We mentioned Berkeley. What do they do at Berkeley? And they use hamsters to test sex drive, apparently.
Yep. So at Berkeley, experimenters cut into the skulls of female hamsters and implanted tubes into their brains and pumps into their scalps. And then saline or hormones that are related to sexual behavior were pumped into their brains through these pumps. After this, the animals were videotaped as they were able to see and... Yep, go ahead.
There was a videotape?
Well, this is a behavioral experiment. And so when you're talking about a behavioral experiment on animals, how the animal behaves really is your data. And so to obtain that data for further review, they videotape them. That happens sometimes in laboratories when you're talking about behavioral experiments.
So not only do we have the actual experiment, but we actually have sex tapes available somewhere on the internet, I'm sure.
Hamster sex tapes. I'm not sure whether or not they published these videos online, but they definitely had them for their own internal use and analysis. It's pretty common that even when the experimenters take their own photographs and videos, they don't necessarily like to broadcast these to the world. PETA has a long history of suing laboratories, in fact, to produce these photos and videotapes that they took themselves, because we think that that's actually some of the most damning evidence we can show to the public, is just raw footage of what's happening inside these laboratories.
All right, so they took this video, and what were they trying to observe? What was the objective? What were they hoping to see or not see?
So what they did, too, was that they would stimulate the female hamsters. They used brushes to do this, and they wanted to see the extent of their sexual receptivity, again, as observed by their back-arching behavior. And then people would observe that, the people affiliated with this laboratory would observe that and rate on a scale their sexual receptivity. And then again, the animals, these hamsters, were killed and their brains were dissected after this.
So all this at UC Berkeley, that very liberal institution in Northern California, to test the sex life of the hamster. And what did it cost?
This experiment was $1.8 million.
So,
and again, this experiment's no longer ongoing, which is a good thing that no more hamsters in this particular lab are going to be subject to this. But I asked the same question again. Now that it's all over and you can do sort of a retrospective evaluation here, what was this worth really? What did this really contribute to doctors and medical professionals who actually treat people? It's just shocking that no one in this whole system goes back and asks those questions.
But now also, if this is going out to the subculture of, I should just say, just these scientific curiosity seekers, then there must be one guy out there saying, well, they're not taking videotapes of these hamsters. Maybe I can do it, not in Berkeley, but I can do it at, some other state, in Delaware, in the mid-Atlantic states, in the South, or whatever, right? I mean, this is an opportunity for somebody, right? They're not just cutting off this type of experiment. They cut it off at Berkeley, but it doesn't preclude someone from saying, hey, I just found my new calling.
That's right. And in fact, what you'll see sometimes in the animal experimentation community is everything I just described to you, if you think about it, has a lot of different variables that can just be manipulated or tweaked, and then supposedly now you have a whole new experiment that's worth doing. So maybe everything I just described to you that they did to hamsters, maybe someone out there says, let's see what happens with mice when I do that, or let's see what happens when I do it with rats. You can change the species, or you can change this or that. You can always just kind of tweak things, and that's why you'll also very commonly see in a lot of published papers and in grant abstracts, they'll conclude by saying, here's some shortcoming. We did this in hamsters. We don't know about it in rats or mice. So this is an area for further future research. You'll see that all the time, that papers will conclude with what is basically a suggestion or opening the door for more funding to do something slightly different. And it's sort of just endless. You can keep on tweaking things and publishing papers, but these papers ultimately just gather dust on a shelf somewhere, or, they're not even really printed, a digital shelf somewhere. No one really looks at them. But nevertheless, you can keep getting funding. You get some grant money yourself, and so does your institution. And so from that perspective, it's a success.
All right. There's one of the experiments that you profiled that PETA found. There is one that's still ongoing. 4 have been shut down, but that doesn't mean that, someone won't pick up the thread somewhere else. But there is one of the experiments that you did find that is still ongoing, and that's at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And tell us, what are they doing that's incredibly obscene and heinous and just as downright perverted? What are they doing there in Ann Arbor?
So the experimenter in charge of this laboratory's name is Eric Nestler. And what's happening in the Nestler laboratory is they're looking at, it's with rats, and they're looking at the rats' interest in drugs following brain damage and sexual withdrawal. So he does a whole variety of experiment of addicting rats to cocaine and opiates. And then on one of his experiments, he has a twist where he's seeing how sexual withdrawal is involved in this. So what they did was they measured the time taken for male rats to mount females, insert their penises, and ejaculate. And the experimenters restrained the rats, cut into their skulls, implanted tubes into their brains, and pumped in a chemical that would block the rat's ability to process sexual pleasure. And then after they did that, they watched the rats having sex. They withheld sex from the rats for 7 to 28 days, and then noted whether or not the rats had an increased interest in an amphetamine after this. So there's a lot of different things going on there.
Yeah, as people say, that's a lot to unpack. I guess that's the phrase that people use these. And of course, scientifically, what's there to unpack about you withhold sex from a rat and they want sex? Don't they always want sex? I don't know. Or we're substituting a human for a rat here, I guess, right?
Right.
And I mean to make it relevant.
And you can design any kind of experiment you want in your laboratory, and on some sort of, I don't know, primitive curiosity level, I guess it's interesting in some way to know if I lesion this part of a animal's brain, or if I inject some chemical in their brain to interfere with receptors of pleasure, all that kind of thing, and then you look and see how their behavior changes. You can design an experiment that I guess is sort of internally valid in that sense. But then the bigger question again, what does all of this mean for the world of human medicine? That's what this is all supposed to be about. That's why the federal government originally created the NIH, was they said we need to have a government agency out there that's funding research to help advance medicine. And we've strayed from that mission greatly.
Yeah, but for the world of the human researcher, just think, he not only has his rats to play with as part of his implements and his tools and his materials, but he also has all these drugs. He's got cocaine, he's got amphetamines, which I'm sure he puts in a safe place so no one abuses it. I mean, unless he have very little of these materials left for his experiments on the rats, these meaningless experiments. And so he's got to have all these, or I don't want to just blame a he, it's Dr. Nestler, but there probably are some females among them too. But it just is one of those things where you read the detail and a little goes a long way. I mean, once you get past the headline of rats' interest in drugs tested following brain damage and sex withdrawal, and you just wonder, why do I need to know this? Why do we need to spend? And I guess the cost is really the eye popper. What was the cost for these experiments in Michigan?
So for these ones in Michigan, which sadly are ongoing, so far taxpayers have spent over $4.5 million on this. And if you just think for a moment about what we could do with that money instead of this, because economists like to talk a lot about something called opportunity cost. Just anytime you have a finite pool of resources or money, when you choose one place to allocate those resources, you're necessarily choosing another place not to allocate those resources. So, I mean, we have a serious problem in this country of access to affordable health care for our own people. That's pretty well documented. And imagine what these funds could do if we allocated it to that problem, to actually delivering real care for people, instead of funneling it into some sort of laboratory somewhere where we're lesioning rats' brains and watching how it affects their sexual behavior. It seems like such from a utilitarian perspective, I guess, of trying to do the most good with government resources, this just seems like insanity, doesn't it?
A reasonable person would read this and they would say, or they would look over these experiments and they would say, there's something obscene, there's something perverted there's something just downright, it's cruel to begin with, but the perversion, you would have to wonder if there isn't it is representative of the regular world. So the same number of perverts that would exist in the real world would exist within the scientific community. Maybe more.
Right.
And maybe this is where
more.
they get the excitement that they're trying to see is present in the rats and the mice and the hamsters they torture. It's a sadistic sense, though. If our listeners are appalled by this, what can they do? What should they do?
So we have an action alert on PETA.org related to this exact campaign effort, where you can urge the NIH to cut funding for that last experiment that's happening in the Nestler laboratory. So I would just recommend the actual web URL to find the action alert's a little long, but you should be able to just Google PETA sex experiments on animals, and it should be your first hit. And there's a little form there that you can submit. You can also just contact your members of Congress on your own and urge them to support diverting NIH funds to only human-specific areas of research, which right now is where about half of NIH's budget already goes. We just want the other half to be diverted into that as well. And I want to really quickly, touch upon the point that you made, that like these experiments are kind of an opportunity for people to act out on some twisted impulses. I don't think that the majority of animal experimenters are necessarily sadists or getting some sort of pleasure. I think that they've been kind of brought into a culture that doesn't even see the animals. Like I said, they're viewed as just another piece of laboratory equipment. And so I don't think that they think about hurting the animals any more than they would think about hurting the cage that the animal's housed in. It's all just equipment to them. But that being said, I do think that there is a certain percentage of people who are involved in the animal experimentation industry who probably are sadists. And the way I like to think about it, or the way I do think about it, is it's not that all animal experimenters or most animal experimenters are sadists or have dark impulses. But if you are a sadist and you do have a dark impulse, this seems like a career that might be attractive to you. And so I think that the animal experimentation industry should probably do more to make sure that they're, I guess, weeding those kinds of people out.
We'd see all the deviants attracted into the research world, which would give a bad name to legitimate research, which there still must be some. There has to be some legitimate research, isn't there?
I think that the whole paradigm is a failed paradigm now. So it's saying that there's some legitimate research with animals is sort of like saying that there's some legitimate areas of phrenology, which is where we looked at the shape of someone's skull and measured the dents in their skull to try to predict their characteristics. And it turns out that whole way of thinking was actually just sort of flawed from the get-go. And I honestly think that that's where we are with animal models as well. It's a failure in fundamental thinking to think we can look at how a disease behaves in one species or how a drug reacts in one species and think that's going to provide useful information for us about how it reacts in another. That's just a fundamentally flawed assumption. I think the data now is abundantly clear on that. And I think that we have better methods of prediction at our disposal, like organ on a chip, in vitro methods. Computer modeling is getting incredibly powerful now. And all the time, we're learning that these new tools are just statistically more powerful tools of prediction than these outdated animal models. So I honestly do think that the only reason this is continuing is because of inertia and habit, and that you have animal experimenters who have been trained by other animal experimenters, and they're not able to think outside of the box.
So they'll die off. I mean, in some ways, this is the digital revolution that's going on slowly which is ironic, slowly in the scientific community, but it's really fast in all these other aspects of life, from Uber in what they're doing to taxis and logistics and everything else, like the Airbnb to hotels. Amazon to shopping, websites to news. My field, the journalism, websites to newspapers. I mean, I used to work at newspapers and even television news stations, electronic though they may be, totally, turned on its head because of the digital revolution. Now people are reacting quickly, sometimes not quickly enough as in the newspaper business, but boy, you're seeing the same thing happen, and the lab experimenters are resisting, and only because of the government, right? Only because they're funded by NIH.
That's a huge part of the problem, without a doubt, is that, if it was their own money that people had to pony up for research and development, I don't think hardly any private organizations would decide to put their own resources, $4.5 million, into seeing how lesioning a rat's brain affects their sexual desire. I think most people would realize that that's a tremendous waste of money when it's their own money. But for these institutions and for the researchers, it's just nothing but a profit. Because that's one of the craziest things about this whole system, too, is, I gave you that figure of $4.5 million. Well, about $2 million of that amount are what are called indirect costs by the NIH. And indirect costs means that the institution, so the University of Michigan in this case, can take that money and put it into general and administrative costs to build new buildings, to do all kinds of things in their budget. And so there's a huge financial incentive to just pursue grants at any availability. And so that's how a lot of this just continues to be self-propelled.
Yeah, the money's fungible. You get 4.5, you can use 2.5 for whatever you want. It's sort of like the slush fund and for the university, and it's all done really not just on the backs, but on the lives of these animals.
That's right.
Well, Jeremy, thanks for enlightening us with all these sex tales from the labs. It's just hard to really understand, but people can read up on the experiments and they can take action by going to PETA.org. So thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you for having me.
PETA's Jeremy Beckham with the Laboratory Investigations Department talking about those perverse experiments conducted with your tax dollars in your name, right? At the University of Michigan and other universities. We've got to stop them. If you're somewhat upset by listening to his recount of the experiments, take action. Go to the show notes or go to PETA.org. And that's our show for today. Hey, contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or on AMOK.com. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on Apple Podcasts, where you can rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. And don't forget, you can help the animals and PETA if you have Amazon's Alexa. Just say, Alexa, donate to PETA. Our music is provided by Carbonworks. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.